It's Our Story. Joan Headley, St. Louis, Missouri.
Gini Laurie became involved with the Rehabilitation Gazette in the 1950s, but the story goes back further than that. She was born in the early 1900s. Her father was a physician in St. Louis, and he had had two daughters, one named Virginia and one named Grace. The family story was that he brought polio home from the hospital, and these two sisters died from polio. They then had another daughter, and they referred to this daughter as their replacement child, and they named her Virginia Grace, and then that was Gini for Virginia. And she also had a brother who was older than she, who had gotten polio as well, but didn't die from it, but was rather significantly disabled. And so she grew up her whole life advocating for her brother and making sure that he was involved in activities. She would tell stories of how she thought her father was rather hard on her brother in demanding him to do a lot of things. But she also, I think, decided that that was good, that he had those expectations of him. Anyway, fast forward to then when she was married and living in Cleveland during the 1950s epidemics. She volunteered at one of the respiratory centers that was created around the country. The one in Cleveland was called the Toomey Pavilion. The respiratory centers were created in the early 50s and paid for by the March of Dimes because they realized that there were people who used iron lungs spread out all around the country, and they thought they could give them better medical care and better rehab if they brought them to one place where people specialized in taking care of, but in providing medical care for people in iron lungs and also rehabilitation for people in iron lungs. So people then stayed in those respiratory centers for a long time and got to know each other. So it was natural then for the centers to create newsletters. And she edited that. For years it had several names, and it eventually became known as the Rehabilitation Gazette. The other part of the story is that when her husband retired, then she and her husband Joe moved back to St. Louis, and I think that was in 1971. And so she and he published information for people with disabilities, specifically polio survivors, up until she died in 1989. They would communicate with people with disabilities. They would write her letters. She would take the letters, collect them for a year, and then she would compile them and put them in a newsletter or in a booklet and send it to anybody who had a disability that people told her about. And then it grew because people would tell other people, oh, you need to get this information from her. They'd send her their name, and then she'd put them on the list so they would get her newsletter as well.
The It's Our Story project is a national effort to make disability history public and accessible. Visit us at www.itsourstory.org or on the It's Our Story project YouTube channel.